Okay, well, good afternoon for those of us. I can't hear anybody, of course, but let me just start by thank you for attending my session. Mostly I'm here to answer questions as quickly as I can for everyone about what code enforcement does, but it probably will help if I start by telling you exactly what we do, which is, and I called it code enforcement. I'm still not used to the title code compliance. Uh, I've been doing this for about 20 years. And so I'm used to code enforcement as the title. And about 2 years ago, we changed it to code compliance, in large part because we enveloped a larger tasking. We took on daycares. We started doing licensing of daycares, and we started doing licensing of businesses. Everything from those little scooters you see downtown to restaurants. And we also took on, I think, a lot of stuff just with downtown parking, although that's a slightly separate section, we still get involved. My time here has been throughout the city. There are 7 of us for the entire city, and that's a lot when you think about the number of homes and people who live in Boise nowadays. Of course, when we started 20 years ago, it was a smaller group. But I wanted to begin by also saying that of the 7 of us, 3 of us have been here almost the entire time that code enforcement has been around. And it's not something that many organizations within the city can say. There is a lot of historical knowledge here. So please feel free to ask me a lot of questions about what code compliance has done and what we see our future to be. Okay, I've been asked about light pollution, and light pollution right now comes from 2 sources, and it's always commercial, always commercial. It doesn't happen necessarily from private residences. It's pretty rare. They are focused on 2 different kinds of light pollution. One, if a commercial property has lights that are too bright or exceed a certain distance from the building. And the other light pollution we have, of course, is from signage, and that's mostly digital signs, those reader boards that you see banks or other businesses put up. There's a measurement that we can look at on their computers when they set up to make sure they're not too bright, there's not too much movement. And that's it for light pollution. The second question I have is about recreational vehicles. And recreational vehicles are, it's not a matter of what type of recreational vehicle can be in a driveway. It's a matter of the space that's allowed for the parking. In other words, if you can imagine from your front property line, the first 20 feet towards the house is called the front setback. And within that setback, recreational vehicles largely are not allowed to park there. Daily drivers, like the vehicles we take to work or take our kids to school, those are allowed to park in that front setback. But otherwise, again, it's not a matter of the type of recreational vehicle. It's just a matter of the surface that it's parked on and how much space it has to be parked. In other words, if it's in that front setback, we're usually going to talk to the owners and have them remove it. ATVs, of course, are allowed on a driveway. It's not the type. It could be a motorhome, or it could be a boat, or ATVs on a trailer, or just ATVs. All those vehicles are licensed. Even trailers, like a pop-up trailer, is licensed, and so it's considered a vehicle. Okay, I'm glad everyone can hear me. So keep the questions coming via the chat, type them out, and I'll answer them as soon as they come in, because I can't tell I can't hear anyone else on my side for whatever reason, but I can read the chats and I'll answer them as fast as I can. I'll add some more things in there until I get to questions. So code enforcement is in every neighborhood throughout the city. And one of the questions we got are, what are the kinds of codes that can be enforced in subdivisions? Now, we don't look at a neighborhood as a subdivision. We simply look at neighborhoods, and we take the entire breadth of a neighborhood into consideration. So the north end, of course, we look at code compliance in the north end quite a bit differently than we say up in the bench area, say the Vista neighborhood. And even within the Vista neighborhood, it's different depending on what side of the Vista you're on, towards Federal Way or more towards Roosevelt and some of those areas. I don't know that we have a commonly misunderstood concept of zoning. I know that for zoning compliance, I can talk about that. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that people think we own the property, we should be able to do what we want. And to that end, yes. However, we also live in neighborhoods, and some of what we do offends other folks, or at least it puts us in a position of having to enforce codes that come before the city council. And one of those ones is like opening up a business. It seems like a small thing to turn part of your garage into, say, a hairstyling salon. But in that particular neighborhood, if that affects traffic flow, if that affects parking, if that affects any number of things, we can't have it. A machine shop, of course, is much different than, say, a hairstyling salon in someone's garage, but a machine shop out back, or even somebody doing shade tree mechanics, those things matter in a neighborhood. And so a lot of folks, when we come up to them, they say, hey, I'm not hurting anybody. It's not a matter of hurting. It's a matter of the fact that at some point, the city council determined that that code needed to exist in order to protect the neighborhoods. Now, what I encourage folks to do, especially neighborhood organizations, is to get together and, approach the council, approach planning and development services if they want to have codes that they think are not right changed. One of the weird things about neighborhoods is that they can make choices. So there's a rule about roosters. And throughout the city of Boise, you cannot own a rooster, with the exception of one area. And when they made themselves a neighborhood, they wrote in there that they could have roosters. Now, largely that was because of the size of their properties. Each of them had, let's say, at least a quarter to a half acre in each area. And so in that sense, having a rooster made some sense to that neighborhood. They'd always had roosters there. But in other neighborhoods, of course, where houses, especially nowadays, are almost within arm's length of each other, someone having a rooster bothers 17 houses versus maybe just one neighbor in this very specific neighborhood off of Collister. So the question is, so property rights aren't ultimate, they can be limited. I don't know if I want to speak to it that way. I think I want to speak to it in the sense that our job, which is basically the same job it was since the 1800s when code enforcement was started, back when it started in the Chicago area, when they decided that, based on Chicago fires or based on, depending on how you look at the lore, it's either based on the Chicago fires or it was based on the meatpacking plants in the Chicago area and how gross and disgusting it was. Code enforcement was born in a way during that time. And it wasn't born out of limiting a property right. It was born out of protecting the public at large. So in some sense, what I hear mostly from folks who turn in complaints is whatever that person is doing, and they'll point at their neighbor, it is lessening the value of my home. Now, I don't know that that's true. I've never seen that to be the case, but it's the belief. It's the common held belief that that person having a couch on their front yard has absolutely lowered the value of their home, at least in their minds. And that matters to some degree. It used to be that in Canyon County, one of their code enforcement rules was you couldn't do anything on your property that would in any way make negligible someone's pursuit of happiness. Now, that was a very difficult thing to enforce, But the idea, the principle behind it is that you shouldn't be doing things on your property that makes negligible other people's happiness in their neighborhood. And for some people, everyone having perfect yards is really important. And we have those conversations and explain to them it's not really about the prettiness of the yard. In other words, we don't regulate ugly, but we do, however, regulate when people do things that are, or at least put on the appearance of regulating, or excuse me, making negligible other people's, I guess, enjoyment of their own property. So to some degree, if you have 3 or 4 inoperable vehicles and people get sick and tired of looking at that, then that's probably how that code got started. So again, lights in neighborhoods, lights nowadays, of course, have gotten quite a bit brighter, and our codes aren't exactly matching that. Right now, we only regulate the lights mostly from commercial properties onto residential properties. In other words, we have people with safety lights on all the time, and it doesn't limit them in any way. The current code, now the codes are being rewritten, the codes are being looked at. We recognize that our codes are sometimes written in a vacuum, and technology moves faster than our ability to write codes or rewrite them in certain ways. We can, however, and we've done this for years, approached people with a kind of Andy Griffith mentality. And for those of you who don't aren't old enough to recognize that particular reference, it's very much just knocking on their door and asking them if they would mind turning the lights down or adding a pretty easy to find accoutrement for that light that limits the light to just facing straight down. And most of the time, actually, we recommend neighborhoods, or at least residents, knock on each other's doors and actually have conversations with each other. I know that seems somewhat dangerous, that everyone's afraid to get a bonk in the nose. And what we found historically in 20 years, I've never had anybody call me and say, hey, I got a bonked in the nose because I asked my neighbor to fix something. Never had that happen. And again, I've been doing this for a long time. I am the most senior guy probably in the state, and one of the more senior ones in the Northwest. I've never heard of it. So we encourage people just to talk with their neighbors, have those conversations that matter. And I think that the most important thing that HOAs can do is encourage that kind of crosstalk without making it something where it's a letter with a threat, that there's in fact a conversation that's had. All right, what else can I talk to someone about? I can tell you a couple things that we're working on right now. In the past, we were pretty black and white about how we approached folks. In other words, we just would give them a notice of violation. What we've been working on recently is changing that to a kind of a courtesy letter. In part, I think, because we found that we don't write that many citations, and that ultimately is what we end up doing with folks, is just writing them a citation, and they have to go see a judge if they can't conform to whatever the ordinance has. What we found is, purely factually, actually 99% of the time, people will comply with the ordinances just by us asking. And so we felt like writing them a letter threatening them with having to go to court and all that kind of stuff probably needs to be backed up a little bit. So we've been looking at courtesy letters, but we've also been looking at it as kind of a sign of the time. COVID brought us to the idea that people weren't talking as much. We certainly weren't out as very much. And what we found is that these courtesy letters were actually appreciated because folks have been getting hammered from every corner, and us taking a nicer approach with it has really helped out. Someone's asking about camera filming in neighbors' backyards. Well, I can't speak to that. That sounds very much like a police issue, not something that we would have anything to say about. None of the ordinances I could possibly do anything with, would address filming somebody in their backyard. Our property rights, our property ordinances are really based on just a few things. We're going to look at vehicles on the yard. We're going to look at stuff that is left there that's trash or junk or rubbish. We're going to look at weeds and grasses that are too tall, especially in the spring and summer. We're going to look at whether or not they're running a business, be that a daycare or, like I explained earlier, a hair salon or a machine shop, or whether or not they're actually running a business. Some people maybe bring home their commercial truck every day, or what looks to be a commercial truck every day. They don't run the business from there. Maybe they run some sort of maid service, and we have to look at, do employees show up there, or is it just the owner showing up there every day, and that's where they do their books, and they're not really running the business from that property. It gets a little shady. We look at animals. We look at, people have exotic animals. Are they trying to keep a horse in their backyard, or an alligator, for goodness sakes? Are people trying to run, are they trying to, say in the north end, are they building in an area, or cutting down a tree, or taking something down that they should not be because it has historical significance? Or in any neighborhood, are they building sheds or any other kinds of exterior buildings without any kind of permits whatsoever? And sometimes it gets a little tricky. What constitutes a tree house? For example, if I cut all the branches and limbs off of a tree and I put a small building on the top of it, is that still a tree house, or is that just a shed on a stump? And we've had that issue before. All right, what else can I tell you about? So, yeah, Roberta, let me try to answer your question the best I can as far as, can I provide a brief overview of code enforcement in Boise? So each of the officers, there's 7 of us, take a specific area of town. Now I have kind of a large area. I'll use my example. I have a large area. My area goes from BSU area all the way out towards on the other side of Micron, all the way from the foothills to the top of Vista. And what I do in those areas is I receive complaints. 99% of everything we do is a received complaint. In other words, somebody calls in to us and says, hey, there's an issue. And the only time that we really start a case is if we see something really egregious. Egregious might be, as an example, in the BSU area during the springtime or late spring, when all the students start moving out, we might find that somebody empties out their garage of all their junk into the alleyway. And then we'll start a case, right there and then. Or if it's a fire hazard or it represents some other sort of hazard to the neighborhoods in general. But once that case is opened, we go to the property, we take pictures, we confirm that a violation exists, or we look at the concern, we talk with the reporting party, and we keep that stuff. We never tell anybody who the reporting party is. If there's a violation, we'll send them a notice of violation. We'll come back in approximately 10 days. And after that 10 days, if they haven't cleaned it up, or they have no intent of doing it, we'll either send a contractor out there to get the cleaning done, or if it's weeds or high grasses, we can send a contractor out there to cut it down for them. And then we charge them for the cost of that work, whether it be the cleaning of the weeds or the cleaning of the trash or rubbish, or in some cases, and in most cases, when we do that kind of cleanup, we also attempt to write them a citation, and then they have to go to court for something like that. That's the briefest overview I can give you of what we do. So Danielle asks about parking on the streets, having too many cars. No, there is no code that says there's a limit on the number of cars a resident can keep on the street. However, just like on a property, we don't allow folks to keep and maintain inoperable vehicles on the street. And right now, an inoperable vehicle, whether it be on the street or on a property, is defined in two ways. So inoperable is that it is mechanically inoperable in one form or another, or the vehicle doesn't have a good plate or good tags. And in that case, it would be illegal to drive it on the street. So for a legal perspective, it's an inoperable vehicle, and we would address it that way. So the other thing too is I would say this too about how we operate. So we never look at HOA rules. We never ever look at HOA rules. They don't have any application to us at all. In fact, what we find is what we recommend most of the time is that HOAs either mirror or very closely mirror their rules to ours. It just makes it easier. Or they could just reference all violations to the city code, because we can cover just about everything, or we do cover about everything an HOA would. But we don't really care about HOA rules or whether or not somebody's violating it. We would never talk to anybody that way about it as far as how we operate. The next question, tree hanging over sidewalks. Okay, so there's a couple principles here. Yeah, it can hang too low, and there is a rule about that. I have to read it again. It's either 8 or 10 feet above the sidewalk, and we'd ask them to trim it up. But it also depends on where it is over the sidewalk. So by that, I mean, we're looking at the height over the sidewalk as one part of the rule, but also whether or not it blocks oncoming traffic. So if I go to a stop sign and I'm parked in my vehicle and I look to my, let's say the tree's on my right, and I look to my right and I can't see down the street at all, then I would end up talking to that property owner and saying, hey, your tree or bush, shrubbery, whatever it is, actually is in violation of what we call the clear vision triangle. And the clear vision triangle, if you can imagine a street corner, it's 40 feet down, all the way to my right. And if I'm at the street corner, 40 feet down to my back, and I create a triangle. And in that triangle, there are rules about anything actually be it a water fountain or be it vegetation. There are very specific rules. We probably won't make someone cut down a tree, but we would make them, in most cases, cut the branches up in such a way that it didn't impede a person's ability to see down the street or see oncoming traffic. And nowadays, of course, while school's in session, we really do look at that, because kids, as you may know, aren't always paying attention to vehicles, and vehicles are often, or people driving in vehicles are often paying attention to other vehicles, not what's coming down the sidewalk. So we're pretty careful about that stuff. We consider that the clear vision triangle violations as something that we get after right away, and we will bring a contractor out fairly quickly, and we'll write citations fairly quickly if people don't fix those problems, usually within a couple days. Most of our notices will say, hey, you got to fix this within 10 days. If we consider this to be something that's imperative, we're going to look at it and say, you have 3 days to take care of this problem, or at least start to take care of this problem, take care of the worst of it, so that we can get those corners safe. We do deal with a lot of vegetation issues, especially during the summer, overgrown grasses and weeds. That tends to be about 80% of our business in the spring and summertime. And I have to be careful about this. there's a difference between a dead yard and overgrown grasses and weeds. And what we use is we use the fire code has the measuring stick by what makes a violation. So grasses and weeds that are dry and likely to be burned and are more than 12 inches in height and cover more than 50% of a property, that would be a violation. What we have is a lot of people calling in and saying, hey, my neighbor hasn't watered their lawn in 5 years. Okay, but when we get there, there's no lawn because they haven't watered it in 5 years. It's ugly, perhaps, but it's not a violation. Or we get, really sparse growth of grasses and weeds. It's just, a chunk here and a chunk there, but it doesn't cover more than 50% of the property. Well, we can't talk to them about it. However, as I referenced earlier, it might be that, and this happens a lot when we have in those neighborhoods where when you have a number of properties that line a street and then they have a fence and then there's a vegetative area that goes between, say, a fence and the sidewalk. Well, the person in this property isn't paying attention to the vegetation outside their sidewalk, outside their fence, even though it's their property and there's weeds there. I'll knock on the door and ask them pretty nicely, please take care of this problem. It's a fire hazard and we'd like you to take care of it. But when I say fire hazard, I have to sort of say it tongue in cheek. It's not a definitive fire hazard. I just have to tell them that this is a problem. When somebody flicks a cigarette, some kid does something dumb, as kids are likely to do, especially during the summertime when they're bored. Something like that starts a fire, and it's really hard to stop at that point. Another area that we've gotten into recently in the last couple of years are daycares. And daycares are highly regulated. So we get quite a number of called in complaints from folks who say, hey, we have an unregulated daycare in our neighborhood. And it's a big deal, mostly because daycares providers are required to go through FBI background investigations. And clearly there's a good reason for that. And so we enforce that code pretty hard. We will shut them down. We will give them a cease and desist notice of violation right away. So when we're talking to neighbors and neighborhood organizations, we really do ask them to take a look at this, because I think parents, they would not know necessarily if that person, or if either the owner or the people working there have a criminal background, that we would say, we don't want you taking care of kids. We don't think you should be taking care of kids. They'd otherwise be denied a license. So they wouldn't necessarily know that. In the same way, you wouldn't necessarily know that that contractor doesn't have a license. Or every year we get dozens of complaints of people who say, hey, this contractor took my money, but they never got anything done. Or this contractor took my money, but didn't actually get a permit with the city. And what happens, especially during the summertime, is that with those contractors is that they will actually put it in their bid to get a permit from the city, but they never do. So during the springtime, we tend to put out flyers, and we tend to really speak to HOAs and ask them to put out to their neighborhoods, hey, before you start building, but anywhere actually in the city, but especially in the North End where the historical overlay exists, make sure you talk to the city. Talk to Planning and Development Services. If you want to put in a shed, if you want to build a tree house, if you want to make an addition to the garage or a house, go talk to the city. Find out what you can and cannot do. Don't spend the money. Don't build the fence. Don't re-roof, etc., without talking to the city and making sure you don't need a permit for those actions, because we would end up writing a citation and or making you take it all down again, and that becomes cost prohibitive for everybody. And it's a no-win for us with the city. We don't like being in that position, but of course we have to. What other questions can I answer for folks? Well, none are coming right away. The other thing that we do a lot of is we work with the Boise Police Department, and usually the community officers. They have a job not dissimilar from ours in the sense that they work hand in hand with neighborhood organizations, and they really take a lot of calls saying, hey, we suspect this is going on or suspect that's going on. And they'll use us in the same way that we use them, either to get on the property or take a look at the property in a way that we normally could not. And we work hand in hand with them. Somebody does ask about, do all re-roof projects need permits? I don't want to say all, but I want to say some. I want to say maybe even most. But that is part of what I'm talking about when I say go to the second floor of City Hall or write to one of them in these COVID days. Certainly make an appointment and talk with somebody about what you need to do. We've done a lot to really improve our online process with planning and development services, including reaching out to the planners and asking them questions. And nowadays, of course, they can pull up. We have good, has the flow cry, has the crow flies pictures of the city. We can look at your property. We can look at your property in relation to other properties and get pretty good measurements and let you know, hey, you can put a shed here and here, but not here because it's too close to the property line. Or you in order to re-roof this area, you might need to get an engineer approval, or maybe it's just a matter of just getting the right permit and having it inspected by one of the building inspectors to make sure it's being done right. The same is true, by the way, of a number of projects that I know people take on their own. They hire an electrician to change their to change out their electrical panel in their garage, or they get a water heater changed. Many of these actually require permits. And as far as fences, you don't need a permit anymore for a fence. However, fences are tricky because they are regulated as far as height, and they're regulated about where they can be built. So, as an example, from the front face of your house back, the fence can be 6 feet tall. But if you're going to build a fence, say, along your property lines on either side, there are height limitations. And in some cases, you'll see people build it at maybe 4 feet for a little bit, and then it slopes down to 3 feet. And part of that is, I'll take you back to that clear vision triangle problem. So if your neighbor's driveway is right next to your property, it can't be more than 3 feet unless you have an open slat fence, maybe a metal fence where they can easily see through and they're not being hampered from seeing oncoming traffic as they back out of their driveway. And fences get tricky too, because you definitely want to make sure it's on your property. If you build a fence on somebody else's property, and that hasn't anything to do with the permit, but what we find is people get in disputes about fences more than you would think. Robert Frost's idea about fences make good neighbors is not true when it comes to code enforcement, because when fences start to fall down, there's a lot of argument about who's responsible for it, or, hey, I built this fence, but it turns out it's actually on somebody else's property, and so they chopped it down, and it cost me thousands of dollars, and we get a lot of neighborhood arguments. So what I recommend to folks is they absolutely know where the property line is. They absolutely know that they cannot build a fence more than 6 feet tall on any portion of the property for any reason. As a general rule, I should say that, for any reason. Now, there are some who get permits, and they'll get a conditional use permit that'll allow them to build a slightly taller fence in some cases where they can show a definite need to do so. And it doesn't always get approved, but sometimes it does. One other thing that code compliance officers will do is we'll actually come speak to your HOA. If you, during your regular meetings, if the HOA, you have a regular meeting, so the north end and the east end, they have regular meetings, and they'll bring, a panel and people from the neighborhood. And we're very good about accommodating those meetings, even at night. We'll go and we'll talk about what we do and what we're doing in those neighborhoods. We've done a lot of this I've done a lot of this in the BSU area and some of it's just about scheduling planning. So we've scheduled cleanups in those neighborhoods. We've talked about how they might apply for a grant that is a summertime cleanup grant, where they get the really large dumpsters and they say, hey, for the next 2 days or this weekend, we want to fill these dumpsters. We want to empty the alleyways. We want to clean out the garages. We want everyone to get all the junk off their property. We really want to get things cleaned up. And we've got this weekend to do it because we've applied for this grant. We have 2 or 3 large dumpsters, and we brought out the people so you can bring your batteries, your old oil. We're going to take care of all of it over just a few days. The weekend, generally in the spring, is a good example, and some of that we can help do some of the planning on. But we also look at targeted enforcement. So I might talk to a neighborhood association and say, hey, as an example, I might say to them, and BSU is a good example, and so is the North End. There's a lot of alleys in those areas. And I might say, just as an update to them, hey, I'm going to be opening up a lot of cases in this neighborhood, maybe in a 6-block radius specific to the alleys, because it's gotten really bad. The overgrown vegetation is keeping, scratching cars, or people have just let junk lay all over the place, and we're going to get all this stuff cleaned up. You might be hearing from your neighbors because I'm doing a sweep. And we only do sweeps once in a while, but only when they're really necessary. And by necessary, I mean, it's clear to me that the people have started using alleys, or the neighborhood has just gotten lax for any number of reasons about keeping their stuff up. So I might open a number of cases on some of the most egregious. And usually what happens is it sort of gets the ball rolling. You only have to see 3 or 4 people really start to work on their yards and get things done. And pretty soon everyone else is getting the idea, oh, code compliance is rolling through. I better get all this stuff to the dump or get it cleaned up one way or another. And lastly, let me wrap up by saying this. You can call us or email any of us and ask questions at any time after this. I'm pretty good about getting back to folks, especially on email, and my phone gets filled up pretty quickly. Today it's been quarantined by IT for some reason, but I generally get back to people that same day. And you can ask us any questions that you have about your neighborhood, or if it's not me, I'll make sure to get you in contact with the officer who's actually in charge of your area. What we want to do is encourage people to first talk to their neighbors before they call us. But if that doesn't work, please do call us, and understand that especially during the winter months, we have more time, we have fewer cases, and we can really focus on it. During the summertime, each of us carries a caseload of somewhere between 60 and 90 cases a piece, which is a lot. That's a lot of properties that we're addressing. Generally, we get about somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 cases a year for 7 of us. So if we're a little busy, please forgive us. Yeah, I'm going to type it out too, but I'll say it. It's just my first initial, M. So it's M Garner, Garner, at cityofboise.org. And we can, or I can certainly be the person that helps arrange this. If anybody wants to bring us out and speak to their HOA, we'd love to do it. We like making those contacts. We like having our name out there so that people understand this is what we can do and this is what we can't do with code compliance. And we really want to focus on getting neighbors to talk to other neighbors. And we want to also focus and encourage folks to read the codes. Most of them are found in Chapter 11. You can look at the city codes online And if you have confusion about something, it's all on PDF. It's pretty easy to look up. Just type in a word and you can find what you need most of the time. And if it gets confusing after you've read it, please call us, because some of them are in fact confusing. And we want to talk to you about it. We want to make things clear. We're not trying to hide anything or make it tricky or in any way make things oblique when they should just be very, very clear. We want to focus on you feeling like you're a comfortable part of your neighborhood, not to be a tattletale, certainly, but to be someone who is focused on the neighborhood and emerging problems that you see. So call us. I'll put you in the vehicle. Any of us will put you in the vehicle. We'll drive around your neighborhood. You can ask us questions. Hey, is that a violation? Is that a violation? We can put 2 or 3 of you from an HOA as an example, or a neighborhood association in a vehicle after COVID, of course, or we can just walk around. I like walking versus the vehicle. Walk around a neighborhood, talk to folks about these are violations, these are not, these are things we should address, these are things we can maybe wait on, and we can help prioritize, we can help strategize so that we're really watching over our neighborhoods. So I think my time is up, but do any of you have any last minute questions before I wrap up? So somebody asked me about, I did say HOA, not NA. It's both HOAs and neighborhood associations. We go to both groups when we talk to them at any given time. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I will leave this panel discussion. Thank you for those of you who participated. I hope I answered your questions. And again, email me or you can call me if you have specific questions. I will put my number right here. And hopefully the IT department will have my my phone out of quarantine by the end of the day, and we can talk more at your leisure. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.